have a special Hind Keynote which is on legitimizing lobbying and advocacy. For that, I invite Mr. Dilip Cherian, founding partner and group chairman, Perfect Relations. Please.
Good morning and thank you very much. First of all, let me begin by thanking Mr. Samir Kocher for this opportunity to discuss a subject which I have been fairly well involved in for many years. Shama kijiyega, I'll be speaking in English because my Hindi is not good enough for speaking on what I consider a reasonably technical subject. So I will be speaking in English. But thank you again, SKOCH Foundation, for giving me this opportunity. And I'm going to keep my comments brief because I can see a stellar panel which is waiting to discuss issues just after me. There have been lots of jokes about architects, lawyers, bankers, and traders, but not very many jokes about lobbyists. They are the subject of only contempt, and sadly, even in the US, where lobbying is legal, lobbyists don't mention this on their business card. They use euphemisms such as government relations expert or policy and advocacy specialist. And even in India, the word has extremely negative connotations. Recently, I was addressing the young training officers at the National Police Academy, and I was put in a spot by somebody who asked me that, is what you're doing legal? And I had difficulty answering the question because as policemen, they were looking at the backdrop of certain incidents, certain events which they had read about, encountered only in their research perhaps, and I recognized that they were seeing some issue with even treating it as illegal because they recognized that it was being done. And this gray area between lobbying and advocacy is the cause of much confusion and abuse. Even my good friend Mr. Karanjwala, the lawyer, when interviewed recently, said that it is deemed illegal because it is not regulated. My purpose today is to suggest a roadmap of legitimizing. These are activities that happen fully legally, and therefore their not being regulated allows people to throw stones at it. The debate around lobbying was actually introduced thanks to a private member's bill, and as you know, in this country, too many private members' bills don't see the light of day. But it defined, and it sought to define lobbying as communication with and payment to a public servant with the aim of influencing his action. To my mind, the bill was flawed, and thank God it failed, because it didn't differentiate between bribery and lobbying. Lobbying, at the end of the day, is a legitimate activity most usually carried out in the public domain. It is in the full glare of visibility at multiple levels. And therefore, just because corruption is endemic in India, it is not possible to treat every activity which potentially involves players who may be corrupt as illegitimate. In Hindi, the word for any deal maker is the pejorative dalal. But lobbyists are not deal makers. They are policy influencers. What is often mistaken is that either a broker, which also, by the way, I don't consider a bad word, and there are many on this panel who will understand the importance of brokerage. There is no reason why if an activity is simply unregulated, it needs to be deemed as illegal. But instances such as Neera Radia or the exposure that Walmart got due to its expenses on lobbying tend to muddy these waters. But I think that if we are talking of a new paradigm of SKOCH India, if you're talking of a new paradigm of Make in India, the fact is that policy making will require redefining how lobbying is done. Anyone doing business in India knows that to engage with India, you have to engage with the central government, the state government, a whole bunch of regulators, many institutions, and certainly these are not easy to work around. It also requires, to do business in India, an understanding of the coalition politics, the impossible to understand levels of bureaucracy, the dynamic markets, and of course, coping with the fact that just when you've begun to understand it, we change all the rules and start all over again. Lobbying plays a useful role in being able to address some of these issues, and I would position lobbying as a practice performed by an individual or an organization to influence policymakers into specific directions with one of the following three: advice, data, or voicing the needs of industry. A credible case using data and empirical evidence can often help policymakers create and craft a law which is thought through, or amend a policy which is harming the people who it is expected to regulate. A lobbyist can legitimately represent an interest group and persuade a member of a legislature to act in a particular manner. And it can range in terms of providing services, from public services to nuclear power to foreign direct investment. Don't forget that the word lobby itself stood for a place where interest groups would meet parliamentarians before, after, or in urgent cases during a parliamentary session to pitch their side of an argument. Such conversations with government ministries in India seem to be legal and legitimate only when it is done by a CII, a FICCI, or an ASSOCHAM. The fact is that government's needs need to go far beyond these. Today, you already have organizations like NASSCOM, FIO, and CIAM who are sectoral lobbies in some sense. We have an unprecedented opportunity today because right in front of your eyes, the world is being redefined. Many of us are being rapidly replaced by artificial intelligence. Some of us are making or losing large quantities of money based on cryptocurrencies. So the world as you know it is about to be reinvented. And fortunately, to cope with this, a whole bunch of new lobbyists are emerging. You will perhaps have noticed that the Digital Assets and Blockchain Foundation of India has been formed to represent the interests of ventures in the space of virtual currency. Some of you may or may not have noticed that gaming, which is going to be bigger than most businesses that you are currently involved in, had its giants, Ace to 3 and Rummy Circle, recently established the Rummy Federation of India under the All India Gaming Federation to regulate the game under common practices. The association, of course, for starters, advocates self-regulatory mechanisms and also advocates, side by side, know your customer norms and systems which are based on artificial intelligence for detecting potential fraud. Even as we speak, hospitals with problems like Fortis are banding together with other private hospitals to salvage both their name and their reputation, but more crucially, to influence government policy that may be being designed to either virtually shut them down or control them fully. Lobbying in the intensive care unit, so to speak. The naysayers argue that the cozy relationship between the corporate and the political elite creates policies skewed in favor of the corporation, ignoring the nation and the citizen at large. Lobbyists, they say, scuttle pro-people policies and take advantage of the governance deficit, resulting in a systematic conflict of interest and a constant trampling of consumer needs. This isn't true, because no matter how pro-business or how rightward oriented a government is, it has to recognize that it will also have to account for India's poor and the power of the ballot box. After all, that is the ultimate judge and the great equalizer. Today, with governments scared of the earlier dependence on so-called crony capitalists for funding their politics, the need for ethical lobbying is increasing. With government being more and more open, it is inevitable that what used to be termed lobbying, which was essentially suitcase-style bribery, now needs a new face, and it should be redesignated as expert and qualified insights into the needs of both industry or of other interests. And don't forget that we are doing this for multiple social groups who are equally feeling voiceless, and this is a huge opportunity and an action point for lobbyists. So for a good lobby law in India, and I'm going to stop here, I think you need to encourage three things: registration of some kind, transparency of every kind, and disclosure on a continuous basis. But a word of caution: while insisting on either registration, transparency, or disclosure, please understand that the rule of law is contingent on the methods and ways of its enforcement. In other words, rules that are put into place to regulate an activity should not end up being one more source of either harassment or killing the industry which it is meant to regulate. The lobby law should make it mandatory for a lobbyist to register if he is working with government. And if she is doing more than 20% of her business with government, then they need to register themselves as a lobbyist, which is possibly the rule that works well enough in the United States. But definitions in India can change, and we have enough space to do that. But I think that frameworks exist in multiple countries, and all democracies have one form of lobbying in place or another. It is better that it be in the public domain. It's better that some form of regulation be encouraged, and as hopefully elections get cleaner and as governments get more and more on public platforms, especially on digital platforms, the space for errors and for any undue influences, as it is called, would get reduced. Lobbying is important, in my view, therefore, in conclusion, for a productive government, as it strengthens democracy and does not weaken it. It allows participation of multiple interests in policy making. Let us try and push for a doing away of both opacity and push for better regulations in lobbying. If there is, side by side, a redressal system to ensure that cases which go wrong are looked after specifically, then we probably will have a more robust structure than many countries have. Thank you, and I'll stop here.